Before we get into introducing our speakers, first want to take a moment to acknowledge that wherever you are calling in from, you are on Indigenous land. At MOHAI, we're on the lands and waters of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and all Coast Salish people. We recognize that these people were forcefully removed, but honor the endurance with deep respect and gratitude for their stewardship of the place. And to this day, the Duwamish people have yet to receive federal recognition. And we encourage you to visit the Duwamish Longhouse in West Seattle to learn more and continue to learn more about all of the Indigenous people of our area as well. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to MOHAI's Executive Director, Leonard Garfield, who will tell us more about the wonderful lineup we have for this evening. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Rachel, and welcome everyone. And to help those who are joining us who have visual challenges, I wanted to let you know that I'm in my home office with my bookshelf behind me, and I've got my glasses on so that I can read my cryptic notes well. But we're delighted to have you today. This program is inspired, as you know, by the current exhibit at MOHAI, Da Vinci Inventions. Amid all the fantastic and sometimes fantastical innovations that sprang from the brilliant mind of Leonardo, there's an epigram on the wall attributed to the Renaissance man himself. Walking the earth, but turning your eyes skyward changes your perspective. Looking up and out, the essential human and cultural impulse to look around us, to observe carefully the natural and the human world, to imagine beyond the present, and then to explore our own agency in that world. That is the spirit of resourcefulness and inventiveness that was key to the Renaissance. And of course, it's very much a part of our region's history as well. In fact, as I've mentioned before, the term innovation, meaning the application of novel solutions to real-world challenges, came into common usage in English many hundreds of years after Leonardo, around the middle of the 19th century, at the very time that seismic changes were happening here in our Northwest, with a confluence of cultures and commerce. And that's the connection that we will be looking for tonight, between Leonardo's time of the Renaissance and our own time of the inventions of the 19th, 20th, and now the 21st centuries. So to join me in this exploration, I'm very honored to present four amazing thinkers and doers in this space. Let me start by introducing you to Ana Pinto da Silva. Ana is the founder and CEO of Minka, and she drives transformational change at the intersection of home, health, and technology, and go on the website to find out the amazing things that Minka is doing. She defines solutions that seek to strengthen community, increase well-being, and deliver resilience. As a designer, technologist, community leader, and accomplished public speaker, as those of you who have joined MOHAI's innovation programs before know, Ana is dedicated to creating products that matter. Ana Maria Pinto da Silva, welcome to the conversation. And now I'd like to introduce, Dr. Lorraine McConaghy. Many of you know Lorraine as well. Lorraine is MOHAI's public historian emeritus. She's the lead curator of our core exhibit, True Northwest, and co-curator of the Bezos Center for Innovation. Lorraine has been honored by the American Association of State and Local History and the National Council on Public History, and I'm shortening the list of honors because they are many, and she's the author of numerous books about regional history as well. Welcome, Lorraine McConaghy. And thirdly, I would like to introduce Michael Lombardi. Mike Lombardi started at Boeing in 1979 and has been the senior corporate historian for the company since 1994. Mike has presented lectures globally on topics related to the aerospace industry, and he's been honored by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronomics, the Royal Aeronautical Society, the Air League of the UK, and air museums really around the world. Every time I talk to you, Mike, you've just come back from some other country where you've been honored. So welcome, Mike Lombardi, to the conversation. And finally, let me introduce our fourth panelist, Sean MacLeod. Sean is a seasoned executive and entrepreneur who specializes in innovation and the commercialization of life science and biomedical technologies. Sean is the founder and CEO of Phenologica Biosciences, which is an early-stage synthetic biology tools company that empowers biopharma and industrial bioscience companies to accelerate discovery and development of new therapeutic and sustainable products. This is an amazing panel. So I'm going to start by asking each of you one opening question. But before I do that, I want to share with you 4 images from our Da Vinci Inventions exhibit. And so, Rachel, if I could have those 4 images, this is just to help us contextualize our conversation that we'll be having. So look at your screen right now. Here are 4. And the first is the flying machine, this amazing glider. You'll see on the wall there the epigram that I related to you earlier in the program. This notion of observing the flight of birds and applying it to human applications. And if I can have the second image, please. Almost the inverse of that is one of the first concepts of a military tank, this amazing contraption, if you will, which is one of the most popular items in the exhibit. It shows us that sometimes the propellers of innovation come from unlikely sources. Military defense and fortification inspired much of the inventions that Leonardo eventually designed. And this tank is a very creative example of that. The sources of innovation are sometimes surprising, as are the consequences. If I can have the next slide, please. This is what Leonardo called the ideal city, a city that had just come through a pandemic, something we can relate to all too well. How could we organize that medieval city of living so closely together and on top of each other into a Renaissance vision of an organized, orderly city that would promote health and well-being? Leonardo had specific ideas about that, and his inventiveness is reflected here. And then the 4th image, of course, is the famous Vitruvian Man. This notion that humans are where we center our exploration. We reach out to discover the world, and the world is encompassed within our own experience. This notion of humans at the center of creativity is indeed the propelling thought of the Renaissance, which continues to inspire thought and science and innovation today. So let's go to the panel, and let me go back to that initial question and ask you, and we'll start in reverse order of introduction. So Sean, I'm going to begin with you.
Great.
What do you think is the key driver of innovation in our time and in our place?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually just, sort of one driver. And as a matter of fact, I think it's a whole variety of different drivers that are converging in sort of one time and space, and a combination of these different technologies and different capabilities that are really prevalent in this region. It kind of builds on the legacy of Boeing and Microsoft and McCaw Cellular and Immunex, all great exhibits, by the way, at the museum, that you can see this legacy in sort of captured there. But if you walk out the front door of MOHAI and look around, you'll really see this in South Lake Union in action. And you see Google and Amazon and the Allen Institute, and UW is there, and Facebook is there. And so this big convergence of different technologies that are computational and life sciences and robotics and research capacity and things of that nature. I think that's really what's driving the future innovation, the future of the region. And then look around and you can see the water and the mountains, and this convergence of space and time is really what will drive the region and sort of this innovation economy that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Lorraine, what are some of your thoughts about the main drivers?
Well, I'm glad Sean disrupted your question by insisting on more than one driver.
Yeah, did you see I made it plural? I changed the question to plural now, Lorraine.
Good.
So, innovation is this big basket. It's technological, sure, but as Leonard and Sean have indicated, it's also cultural and artistic, and it's also civic. So we have a system of circumstances, really, that are drivers for innovation that almost pelt us from many different sides. And that sort of paradigm where there's multiple paradigms, right? We could talk about the circumstance of where we are and where we have been, that this is a place that fosters collaboration because it is a place that is at the intersection of, well, of ocean and land, of sky and water. It has been since, you know, since time immemorial, as the tribes say. And some of our earliest innovations really do arise from tribal people. But coming all the way up to the present, there are so many drivers, but a driver that has meant a lot to me in my work is the University of Washington. That technology transfer, artistic transfer, cultural transfer, civic transfer, and I'm sure I'm leaving things out that are super important, out of the university and then feeding back into the university. It's that reciprocity of a driver that I think makes it so powerful. It's not just federal research dollars. It's the sort of iterative experience between the many communities that medical devices come out of the university to, and then go back. So there's a lot of drivers, and I know we're going to talk about them throughout the evening.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that you'd mentioned the university because, of course, one of the first private-public technology transfers was really the wind tunnel, which Bill Boeing funded. So that's maybe a good segue to asking Mike Lombardi, if you were to look at drivers, and I know your specialty is aviation, of course, but what are some of the forces that you consider?
Yeah, that's it. And that's the thing, looking at the experience of Boeing, and there's been incredible invention and innovation at Boeing. And what are those things that caused that? There's been empowerment, there's been trust, there's been competition. I think competition is, when you look at the tank, Leonardo's tank, and you think about warfare as the height of competition, that's always been a great driver. But I really think what the great thing is challenging a team with a goal that might be thought of as being impossible. And I think that's where we see some of the greatest leaps in innovation, is when you have a team that's challenged, when they're forced to think outside the box, to really take on something that other people think is impossible. And I think that John F. Kennedy had a wonderful way of talking about this. And one of the great quotes that I'm going to read here, that conformity is the jailer of freedom and the enemy of growth. Thinking outside the box is, and of course, he's the one that challenged America to go to the moon and do this impossible thing, because it's hard. And because it tested the best of our skills and our abilities. So that's what I've seen. That's what's driven innovation and invention, especially in the aerospace field.
Thinking about the impossible challenge and being driven by that, Anna, when I think of Macon, I think of the challenge of housing in a humane and humanistic way. I think of the work that you're doing. How do you frame the core drivers of innovation? And Anna, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Leonard, so much for convening us. And I just want to say I loved so much the answers from Michael, Sean, and Lorraine. I really resonate with all of them. What I would add in here is certainly the strength of our community. Seattle has an incredible sense of community. And that incredible sense of community really rests on a culture of leadership. And what I mean by that is not just a really incredible slate of charismatic individual leaders, but we really have a culture of tremendously inspiring grassroots leaders, and we see leadership everywhere. I would also very much agree with Lorraine. I think that we derive tremendous strength from our Indigenous community. I think that the worldview and the example and the history and the encouragement to do more and do better for our world is very, very inspiring. I think the fact that we have such an incredible connection to our region and to the world beyond. And then, of course, we have the natural resources that are all around us. So, this contrast between the urban environment and this beautiful world that we see every day. And in fact, this idea that, when we're here in Seattle, we can see the Olympics, we can see the Cascade, we can, sense this incredible place, this embrace of nature. I think that that also drives innovation. And then finally, what I'll close with is that we have a wonderful, rowdy, tense, dynamic civic discourse. And I think that that tension is very, very important for driving meaningful innovation. The moment that that goes away, the moment our place on the world stage loses its relevance. So I think that's
That's
actually one of our
interesting.
towering strengths.
Okay, well, now I'm going to launch into all the free-ranging questions because I want to pick up on something Anna just said, which is we have historically identified something called the Seattle process as being, at times, a driver towards civic innovation, where there's a fairly open door, a fairly flat hierarchy, a fairly open invitation to bring smart ideas to the table. Doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. If you've got a smart idea, let's wrestle with it. But we have also moved into a time locally as well as globally, really, where that kind of process has become fractious and it's become divisive, and the voices have become louder, and the solutions as a result have seemed more difficult to achieve. I like what you said, Anna. We need to stay rowdy. How does that work in a collaborative environment as we think of a culture of innovation? Sean, you're smiling, so I want you to take a stab at that.
Oh, great. Thanks. Well, personally, a little tear gas gets my innovative, spirits going. So, those of us who were here during the WTO riots really kind of understand that. And it's some legacy that persists. Yeah, I have to back up into my innovation space a bit, and really true innovation comes from a diversity of ideas, and it comes from a wide range. It's not just demographics, it's life experience, it's social economic, it's technological. And so I think some of that rowdiness really plays into that, diverse thinking, and kind of stretches the mind beyond sort of just, whatever tactical expertise you have to sort of get out of your box and think differently and think from other people's perspective. And I think that really stretches exercises those muscles that are in your brain to sort of think about things differently and go about your day a little bit differently.
Yeah, one of the things I think that we sometimes think of in Seattle, and maybe in our own neighborhood of South Lake Union, for those of us who are near the museum, is that there's a kind of a collision of having many people in the same workspace or the same community or the same culture, that rubbing up against different ideas and different experiences and different people is ultimately good for moving the final result forward. Go ahead.
And leadership. I think there's something to be said for that. Is that if you haven't had some difficulties in your life, or you haven't been challenged in certain ways, it's very hard to be a leader. And you lead by example, or you lead by thought, and so some of those experiences are really important to sort of lead forward with new and creative thinking.
All right.
I think it's important. I love the idea of rowdiness. It's a wonderful word. And it is out of that kind of disagreement that problems are posed, that problems are focused. And, there's many ways to innovate, but certainly one of them is to solve a problem. There's other ways, but that is certainly one way. And when people disagree, they are kicking those problems up to the top of the froth, and then they are presented to us. I would also say that it's a wonderful opportunity for a public history museum to deal with the danger of history. History is dangerous, it's risky, it's not a sentimental, sunny past. Our history, our collective history is littered with evil innovations and crises of many kinds and unresolved issues and unresolved questions. When we recognize the dangers of history, then we can maybe help people to, how would you say it, to articulate problems clearly enough that they can be addressed, to understand what evidence is, and what historians call the preponderance of the best evidence, right? So it's not like all evidence is ever going to agree. So you reach your conclusions based on the majority of the best evidence you can find. In a secular society like ours, in a diffuse community like ours, I think the role of a public history museum is to help people learn how to disagree. So it's a civic role that I find very exciting.
Let me ask a question about that a little bit. When I think of Leonardo, I think of someone who embraced the whole person, who looked very humanistically at people as being complex actors. Increasingly, through Western history at least, the tendency has been to compartmentalize the human experience, to specialize, to become, thinking of this in terms of innovation, to become experts in certain areas and completely unexperienced in others. As we look to the future, how does that notion of a more holistic a humanistic approach to our lived experience relate to the trend towards specialization and compartmentalization? And are we able to get the collision of ideas and experiences that lead to these kinds of outcomes? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've got a thought on that, Leonard. And that's what's ended the Renaissance, that and the Battle of Pavia. But today, what we see, what we're seeing, the challenge is, how do we get our engineers, for example, to think of the next great invention? And what I guess the simple way to put it is STEM versus STEAM, is that we focus very much on the technical aspects. And what I found in talking to our engineers from days gone by, the ones who made the 707, the 747, the engineers that took us to the moon. And what I hear are things like, well, when I looked at that problem, I just thought I saw that it was wrong. I trusted my gut. What that is that they're thinking with their whole brain, and not just the left brain, right? And I think that's the challenge that we need to look at, is that we're really going in this direction. We talk about STEM and we want to teach science and math, but what we're forgetting is that to make that whole person, to make a Leonardo da Vinci, you need to use both sides of your brain. And those great engineers and designers had a classic education. They were artists, and they understood the intersection of art and engineering. So I think that's what we need to focus on. I think for me, that's one of my personal goals, is to get out there in the world and to preach to our schools that you go ahead, teach science and math, but teach art and teach history and teach literature, and let's grow the whole brain.
Anna, please.
Michael, thank you so much for that. I so wholeheartedly agree. And I want to pick up a little bit on some of the comments that Lorraine also made. So just weaving a bit, and also the images that you showed. First and foremost, disruption is very, very important. And the other D word that I think is important to center is discomfort. We have to stay uncomfortable. In fact, we need to become comfortable at being uncomfortable, because to truly innovate means to be out over your skis. If you are not out over your skis, right, you are not doing it right. And so what does that mean? If you're out over your skis, you're not stable. You rely on other people to help keep you upright. And oh, by the way, you are going to turn into a giant snowball when you fall off your skis and you go rolling down the hill, and it's going to be all right. Just going to pick yourself up. People will help dust you off, and back up that mountain you go, slide down again. So this notion of disruption, becoming adept and comfortable with discomfort. But also part of that, and I want to center Michael's comment about art and Leonardo in particular. Leonardo used art as a method of seeing and interrogating. Science is about seeing, and it's not just about seeing, it is about perceiving. So, for example, when you think about EDI work, equity, diversity, and inclusion work, it is essential to innovation, because we must see each other fully in order to see the landscape of opportunity that not only exists within our broader community, but exists in wonderful and idiosyncratic ways within each of us. And when we make assumptions about each other based on very, very narrow criteria, we miss the richness that people bring to each other automatically. And I think we have really have a lot of opportunity there. And then finally, I will say, Seattle has a tremendous arts community, and art and science are united by a pursuit of truth. Damn the torpedoes. They are not there to make you comfortable. They're there to do what is true for their entity. And that's why artists are some of the most important destabilizers, generative destabilizers that exist. So again, going back to Michael, I think it's really important that we elevate and make space and celebrate the tremendous arts community that exists here in Seattle, and bring them forward to collide with engineers, scientists, designers, and other technologists.
Lorraine, were you going to add to that? You were not. Okay. That's the one problem with Zoom. It's very hard to read everybody's body language on the Zoom calls, but on the Zoom calls. Well, let me Anna, go back to a little bit of what you said about we need that diversity of people. I think of who is in the innovation workshop. I've been thinking a lot as I've been exploring the Leonardo exhibit about the notion of a workshop. There is this sort of Western attitude that has been one of the legacies of the Renaissance, sort of an unintended one, which is that brilliance is a self-created thing. You go into the darkened room, you turn the light bulb on, and the great idea happens. And we know that that isn't the case. Who is in the innovation workshop? And how do we make sure that the doorway into that workshop is open for everybody? And we can unpack this question a little bit. But in general, I just want to throw out the question of who needs to be there to create a culture of innovation? Who's at the table?
What I've seen over time is that it's not the one person. A lot of times it's two people. You think the Wright brothers. You think, Allen and Gates, right? There's a brilliant person, and then there's another person who they have a synergy. And the Wright brothers, I think, are one of the greatest examples. Neither one of them would have invented the airplane, but together, the synergy they created became the airplane. But around them is a support team that's just as necessary. For the Wright brothers, it was their sister. And you see this, and this is the story that I want to tell about that airplane hanging in the middle of the museum, the B-1. It's there. We look at it and say, okay, well, that's the first commercial airplane Boeing built. But what it is also is that it's an airplane that belonged to Eddie Hubbard. And why is Eddie Hubbard important? We look at Bill Boeing as this great innovator, this entrepreneur that started the Boeing company, but he had a vision. And that vision had stalled. And it was Eddie Hubbard that came to him and said, Bill, We need to get into the airline business. And that's your vision. You're right. That's it. And so that's what's important about that airplane, is that is that moment of innovation where the airline started. That was where Bill Boeing started his airline, the first transcontinental airline in the United States. And it was because that partnership with Eddie Hubbard. But around them were a team of brilliant business leaders and engineers who helped them to get there.
Yeah, I agree with that full-heartedly. The biggest opportunities are a systemic approach to a problem, not a reductionist type of approach. And I'll make the analogy back to the discovery of DNA. And James Watson gets all the credit, but really Francis Crick was right there with him, and Maurice Wilkins had contributed, and Rosalind Franklin most of all contributed. And so it was that combination of expertise and the ability to put together the learnings from each of them that really unraveled the mystery of DNA and the structure of DNA. And bringing molecular biology and chemistry and physics and structural biology together, at an intersection, really, unveiled that discovery.
Mhm.
I'd love to build on that, Sean, and fold in this notion of the ideal city that Leonard, you showed on the screen. So when we think about the discovery of DNA and the fact that there was a double helix staircase, right, in the building that Watson and Crick were working in is really interesting, right? And so I think part of the answer is who is in the innovation workshop and who isn't. I think we need to take measure of that very specifically, right? And understand right now, innovation is a mighty white space. It just is. And that's unacceptable. That's not going to work for the next generation, truly 21st century innovations that must come forward. And why is that? It's because of values. We need different sets of values that drive the innovations forward, right? Values are our headlights, and they illuminate that landscape of opportunity that extends before us. So it's important that we truly examine how opportunity is accessed. So if we think about the impact of slavery, we think about the fact that racism is an engine of economic theft, we think about the long-term impact of redlining that disallowed, that prevented Black and brown families from home ownership and therefore being able to accrue the wealth that could underwrite their children's access to higher learning. It's no mistake, right? And we know that this is all intentional, it's du jour, right? It's no mistake that we get the demographics that we get at the innovation workshop today. Now, that does not need to stay that way. And I think one of the reasons it's very urgent that we lean into transforming the demographics of the innovation workshop is that innovation creates wealth incredibly asymmetrically, right? So if you don't intentionally disrupt the channels of access to innovation, you're going to get the same answer every time. And I think Einstein was pretty crisp about what happens when we don't make changes to our methodology. On the other side, we have the opportunity to change the access, change the lens, change the playing field, broaden the scope of the innovation workshop, create different vocabularies. I think it's a tremendously exciting time moving forward.
I agree. I'd like to build on that a little bit too. I think the innovation workshop is also an innovation studio. There's somehow there's a host of nouns that might be used there, and I know that technological innovation is only one kind of innovation, but in looking at doing an analysis of U.S. patents as they were issued through time in King County, for instance, you do see something of a diversification in terms of race and gender through time as those patents are offered. It's not ideal, but it is something that certainly could be built upon. And again, I think a museum has a major role here in setting out those studios, those workshops that that let our visitors to the galleries know that they are innovators, that this is not some secret cabal, that, you know, there's some secret password to get in, but that every human being who faces a problem has the opportunity to innovate in solving that problem. It's just that simple. Simplistic and simple are different things. Simple is powerful. Simplistic is dumb. But a very simple and powerful thing that Jeff Bezos said that we tried to use in the Bezos Center was that basic innovations arise in pizza conversations.
Right.
So a conversation no larger than you could all share around a pizza. And then you have to proliferate the pizzas. And then eventually you have a pizza buffet. And then you can move the needle on the world. And he was, you know, very adamant that a light bulb going off over your head in a garage or in a hot basement, that's not innovation. Innovation is when it hits a market, whether that's a market of art or a market of civic change. And that here on the Pacific Rim, we have the fantastic opportunity of a diverse society. And again, it is the museum's opportunity to tap that for innovation.
Yeah. You know, that's in my day at work, I go from speaking with a team in Australia to one in Brazil to another in India. And what I find when we're talking about, you know, this is global diversity, that sometimes when, you know, when I go back to Da Vinci and that curiosity, and to me, curiosity is such an important aspect of innovation and discovery. You got to have that curiosity. That's what drives us to go across the oceans and now across the vastness of space. And sometimes I think here in America, we get a little, you know, maybe we're not as curious and as driven as I remember when I was a kid. But when I talk to our team in India and the excitement they have about the future and being a part of something grand, that they've joined with all these other teams across the world through our company to do these amazing things. And that one of the great things is that they give back to us that inspiration and that curiosity and that drive. And I think that's the important thing, is that we get out there to that broader audience around the world and support each other and inspire each other. And, you know, when we go into space, you know what we are? We're human beings. We're earthlings. And so that's what our future is going to be. We got to lean on each other around the world.
Michael, I would love to build on that. And what I want to offer into your beautiful words is the following, because I just discovered this the other day and it just blew my mind. So you were talking about innovation at the global scale, right? Innovation beyond boundaries. And, you know, if we think about what's happening right now with climate change, the challenges and the incredible disruption and leadership that's happening with younger people, and in particular women, to drive climate change solutions, you know, with far more aggressiveness, I think that's a very inspiring thing indeed. And right now, you know, we have a world that is divided by artificial boundaries, right? Political boundaries are artificial things. They don't really exist, right? They exist as political frames, but the challenge that we face with climate change doesn't know anything about those political boundaries.
Yeah.
And so what I wanted to offer is the following. I looked up the word kindness the other day. And the reason I did that is that I truly believe that innovation without vulnerability is not innovation. It just doesn't work. And then I started to think, well, you know, in the 20th century, we had this very individualistic world, right, where you had these heroes driving innovation. We sort of fetishized that. But in the 21st century, we have to really privilege collaboration. And collaboration thrives under care and kindness. We don't talk about that. So here's the thing I wanted to add in. Sorry for the long preamble. The etymology of the word kindness is derived from the word nation. So can you imagine an innovation community that's propelled forward by kindness to make of our world a nation? And I actually think that that is the invitation, not just for the next century, but for the next millennia. And we should be really thinking about that today.
That's a powerful thought. I want to ask each of you a couple of things. I want to ask you, how do we make sure that all of those voices and people and talents are at the table? Two examples, and Mike, since you're sitting there, we'll use Boeing. Not only was it Eddie Hubbard on the B-1, but it was Wang Su, a young aeronautical prodigy from Shanghai, who came to the United States and helped create this industry that Boeing was helping to fuel. And it wasn't just them, but it was the sailmakers, the women who were making the sails, and it was all the boat builders from the maritime industry. And it was a whole community of people who were taking an existing technology of maritime skills and elevating it to this brand new industry. And in our recent oral history initiative to coincide with Boeing Centennial that you, Michael, helped us with, I remember we talked with one engineer, I will not remember the gentleman's name, who the group at Boeing was pondering a solution and they just couldn't come to the answer until a brand new engineer from India, this is back in the 60s, Lorraine's shaking her head, she remembers this story, maybe you do, Mike, came up with an innovation only because it was based on a lived experience he had in his rural community that had to do with carrying water. Yeah. And it led to a significant fundamental change in aviation history, bringing people to the table. How do we do that? How do we, Anna, you've put probably more thought in this than maybe the rest of us on the call. And you have some notions that as we move to the future, we do need to be very intentional about finding ways to begin to realize the opportunities. What are some of the steps we need to take?
Oh, golly, Leonard, I think we need to make friends with lots and lots and lots of different people. And we need to decenter ourselves as leaders. So I will fold in here something that I've learned from my work in longevity. When you have widespread human longevity, you get emerging life phases. So the first emerging life phase that came from widespread human longevity was becoming a teenager. That didn't really exist in the 1800s. Right. But in the 1900s, you start to see teenagerhood and innovations like, for example, the automobile helped anneal the identity of the teenager, as did innovations like the high school, because it was the first time you had a large cohort of young people coming together to create a sense of identity. Now we have people living, 30, 40, 50 years after they retire. Young people today will live far past their 100th birthdays. And so what this invites us to do is really think about an emerging life phase that I call the legacy phase. Right. And when you bring forward the legacy phase of your career, whose hallmark is really the understanding that the work we're doing is so challenging and so multidimensional, it can't fully be accomplished within our own lifetime. And therefore, we must invest in others and we must invest intergenerationally. Right. Then you start to think about, wow, I don't need to be a leader. I can be a learner. I can let go of my authority. I can take off that mantle of the expert and I can sit side by side as a 70-year-old with a 27-year-old and a 17-year-old, and we can learn and innovate and create together. And by the way, let's do that in different spaces and places. Let's get out of the office. That's very, very important. I think traveling, and that doesn't mean going long distances, it's just putting on your travel mindset and engaging your community in a different way. So those are some thoughts there.
Oh, those are interesting. Sean, you and I had talked earlier this month, well, let's make that last month since this month is relatively new, about something that sort of touches a little bit on what Anna talked about, which is this notion that in the last 18 months, we've been isolated at home. We're doing what we're doing now. We've seen each other from the neck up. We've been constricted to our home offices. But the biotech community and the science community is one of the first areas that really understands that doesn't, so much innovation can happen in isolation. How do you see us going into the post-pandemic world? Will we get those travel skills on and head out to the real world and meet with people, or are we going to stay forever at home working remotely? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's very hard to do biology over Zoom. It's kind of an impossibility, and you have to be at a bench and actually interact with things. I think just to build on what Anna said really quickly too is in the question that was posed is how do you get more people at the table at the innovation bench and especially underrepresented, and I think it starts with those that are around the bench now need to be open to ideas from other people that are not like them, that are just as important. And it just reminded me when I was really young, my dad used to bring me to the office on Saturdays because he left on Friday, kind of things ajar and needed to go back, and there was always a gentleman cleaning the offices, and my dad would interact with him and talk to him and ask him how his day was going, and just be kind to him. And I just remember my dad telling me, that guy is just as important as any other executive that's here. He makes the trains run on time. He's just as important. His input's just as important. And and some life experiences of being on a factory floor and hearing input from someone who's sweeping the floors, providing input and taking that input forward into how we were going to solve that problem at that moment. And so I think it's, the ability to be open to that input is a key ingredient to having more people in the workshop that and that their opinions are valuable. But it really is, that if you're truly doing innovation and there are people around the pizza. And Lorraine, by the way, the last time I saw Jeff Bezos out in public, it was at a pizza joint. So that's just sort of interesting that you said that. If you're standing around the pizza and you're trying to solve a problem, you're building on each other's ideas, and it's not just a verbal or a visual clue that you can get from the shoulders up. It's somebody shuffled their feet a certain way, or someone, if you get to know them and have a relationship with them, you can tell they're distracted and they want to say something, and maybe they're uncomfortable taking that risk, and I'm not sure how you really see that over Zoom. And so when you bring together these people that really truly do these innovative things, and there's some soft skills that are involved in really knowing those people from a relationship basis, and meeting them at the water cooler or seeing them at social events. You get these human cues that, wait a minute, somebody, whoever it is across the table has something to say, and they're going to build on your idea, and you might build back on their idea, and somebody else then gets to say something. And so that's really, that kind of whiteboard interaction and some of those soft skills and some of that interaction that, is not like efficiency that you can get out of kind of communication tools. And sometimes it's just incidental. I'm not quite sure how we get over that in a world where we, talk to each other over Zoom from our bedrooms, and, how does that work? So I kind of predict, for those organizations that are doing, these truly meaningful work, we'll be back together again in person, and we'll be at the whiteboard, and we'll be talking over pizza and making great things happen.
Yeah, and I agree with Sean completely, and that's it. And we're already seeing that at Boeing, that our designers have decided they can't work over Zoom. They need to be together and to innovate. And there was a time long ago when the internet started and all this, what we're doing now, started, and I had a little bit of fear in the back of my mind that maybe someday this could all replace the airplane. But when I see people running to the airport to go on trips, and and this whole, the lesson that I've learned here is that I no longer fear that.
And maybe it creates more opportunity for travel, right?
Right. So, and Anna, if you ever want to start a movement for kindness and civility, give me a call.
Anytime.
I think that to me, that's the most important thing right now, is that we need more kindness and civility.
Yeah. that kind of gets to one of the questions that we have in the Q&A box. Let me get to that because we have questions coming in here and we want to get to some of those. And that is, we've talked about the importance of having different voices and different ideas at the table because it's the only way to innovate. But how do we keep that discussion of ideas, and this goes to civic innovation, cultural innovation, how do we keep it civil when it is uncomfortable, as it must be, as Anna has reminded us? Thoughts on that?
I'm going to try this on. It is important for there to be productive tension. And there are times where people are really on two very different sides of a disagreement and they need to work it out. And it is tough, right? Certainly within my room, my work at Amazon or at Microsoft or MBBJ, and my work at Minka, there are times where the room gets really hot, right? It's just got to get hot. You've got to heat the room up. You've really got to find out what's inside that idea. Why is there so much tension around it? What's going on? Somebody's not getting heard and they feel that that point is important. And so I think the skill here is let the room get hot, but never personal hot, right? It's really about heating up the room, changing the nature of the material, letting it melt a little bit, right? Freezing it back up, letting it change form, understand and interrogate what is going on, and recognize that when that tension exists, that is really, really important. That is when you know you are about to break through, right? So the skill is really how hot can you get it before you break? Right? And what are the behaviors of care that you need to make sure are in place so that you can get the room to that state of heat that you can do truly innovative work? And so what I would say here is that the ability to do that is predicated on trust. You have to build trust at every moment. That is the job of an innovator. Everybody's number one job is to build trust. And when you have trust and you get into conflict, you trust that the other person has a point and a perspective that's important, and you will work it out until it is worked out, right? And I think that that's the investment that we need to make. And I think the last thing I'll say about trust, and in this current moment, I'd love to hear what the other panelists think. Right now, I think we have an incredible fear of the future. Right. And we have Michael and Lorraine, you're historians. I think back to my grandparents' generation. They came of age in the 20s and 30s. The future was one of the most exciting places you could be. I think today we are terrified of the future, but our terror is not going to prevent the future from arriving. And I think this goes back also to our invitation right now as innovators. Every single person who thinks about innovation needs to really lean into their own leadership and say, let's set fear aside. Maybe fear comes along as fuel, and let's reimagine the future together, right? So that we get past the breakers of this fear thing.
Well, and fear can be a motivator, but I think too, if you want to talk about fear of the future, go back to the 1950s and just start watching science fiction movies, because that's what drove all that, was the fear of nuclear war and being the invasion from space, all that defined a culture. That was an underlying culture in America of fear of those things. So the Cold War. So that was a time when that was very evident, and it popped out in the culture. And there's other times too. I don't think we're at that point. I don't think we're at the worst time in history. We're not there. There's always hope. There have been worse times. I actually give this little pep talk at Boeing, because Boeing was the company started just 2 years before the Spanish flu, and we went, and I found a memo that that describes to the employees, here's the measures you need to take to protect yourself from the flu. And it's like reading, it's like deja vu. The same things were said today, except back then they said, please don't spit, right? So, but they also had a huge economic downturn with a post-war downturn that they dealt with. The economy crashed, and people were out of work, and so it was a very similar time. And yet those people still said, in a couple of years, if we can hold out, we're going to get to a place where we're never going to look back. And I firmly believe that we're still in that sort. We're still those same people, that we're going to get through this adversity. And there's a light and I think we're going to see the light at the end of the tunnel pretty soon. And beyond that is going to be an incredible future. And that's my lesson from history.
Well, I think clearly history gives us reason to be optimistic. And maybe one of our questions from the audience can kind of segues into that. What are some of the innovations right now that each of you sees as important, or maybe more importantly, beneficial? Sean, what are you getting excited about in the world these days?
Well, a couple things. I think coming out of COVID and having the general population really tune into vaccine technology and what RNA. What is RNA? Like, more people probably know what RNA is now than ever in history as a percentage of the population, or any technology is as a percentage of the population. And variants. What does a genetic variant mean? Probably single-digit percentage of the population knew that before, probably in the high 80s now, right? So, I think from a science perspective, the engagement with the general population over what some of these things are, and to go back to kind of the single person inventor, we talk about how fast these vaccines came together. True, but the basis for these really came from technology developed during the AIDS crisis, and so it's a historical building of technical advances that allowed us to go so fast. And so I get excited about how fast things went during this very short window when it comes to RNA vaccines and what that means to the future of therapeutics for other diseases, other outside of the flu or COVID.
Lorraine, what's your thought?
I would agree that the COVID epidemic and the response of the scientific community and the medical community has been heartening. There's been a terrible loss of life. There's been unspeakable loss of life around the world, but the speed with which a vaccine was developed and deployed, I think is absolutely remarkable. And I think, again, I'm not sure what the percentage is, but I think there's a hefty percentage of people in the United States, at any rate, that are aware of what a heavy lift that was. I would also say that climate change is, since when you can define a problem, you are much closer to innovating to solve it. And everything that we're seeing in Glasgow now, and have seen in the past at COP conferences, is defining the problem. And there's a kind of optimism, for me anyway, that grows out of that. If I know what I'm facing, I can do better than if I'm facing a sort of faceless ghost. So I do think there's a synergy between our response to the pandemic and what I hope is going to be our worldwide response to climate change. I think it's Ben Davidson, a doctor, a well-known doctor in Seattle, who's been very involved with the African American community in the Odessa Brown Clinic. And I believe it is he who said, every crisis is important because it breeds its own solutions if you just listen. And going back to what we have all said, it's about listening. It's about framing questions. I'm all for that. I want to know what the problem is, but then I need to shut up and listen. And we're living in Metro Seattle. we're living in this dramatically conflicted and contested place. But listening is very important. And again, libraries, museums, universities, places of work, we all have our role in opening up our ears.
I think just to build on that real quick, Lorraine, while you were talking, in a weird way, the pandemic and people tuning into the science and things that were going on there, I think has really shifted the way the world looks at global warming and trying to make solutions. Well, we're all locked down and we sort of broke the everyday treadmill that we all get on. There was a lot of talk about global warming and people digging in and really trying to understand what's going on and thinking about solutions. And maybe a silver lining coming out of the pandemic lockdowns is people really thinking seriously about climate change and what are we going to do about that. And it'd be a weird thing to happen to come out of a flu pandemic and have solutions for global warming really take off. But I think there's been a shift in the last 2 years of thinking around that.
I agree. And I think people look up, if you will, for that kind of a solution. But we've also had the mask phenomenon, where we have learned our individual responsibility. And that translates nicely to global warming, too. It's not just about policy. It's about what I do. If I walk to the market instead of taking a car there, that's a personal choice. And so was masking. I agree with you, Sean. I haven't read about that, but wouldn't that be a cool article? The way that our response to the pandemic has influenced the way we might respond to global warming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really fascinating. And yet there's that, kind of classic American tension between, the sort of civic responsibility, which is a very strong trend in American history. Sometimes it's diminished, but we know it's there from the earliest years of the European American, experience. And then the notion of personal liberty, which we're hearing a lot about, my individual right not to wear a mask. And it makes me think that tension, which is both exciting because it has historically led to some very interesting solutions to challenges, but it also at times seems to get us trapped and more difficult to move forward. Anna, what do you think as I know that you have, a heritage is global and your family has experiences, in earlier generations before the United States. What do you think about our American tension between standing firmly for the individual, and yet also having this tradition of finding great common purpose and volunteerism and all of those great traditions?
Oh, golly, thank you so much, Leonard. This is so apt, so right on. I love the public fist fight that is America every once in a while. We do food fights out loud and proud, and coming from a culture, a Portuguese culture, for example, that's far more staid and more polite, where that type of behavior would be sort of subsumed. It is really important. And it goes back to what I was saying before. People are at odds because important things are at stake. And they can't come together yet because the important things that are at stake for each of the entities have not been fully understood or appreciated by the other side. And part of this is because the issues that we are fighting about in public are complicated. They have historic roots that are poorly understood. And if you don't understand a problem, you cannot solve it, right? And also, we are not always willing to see and listen to each other. So two observations here. I mean, one is a quote, right, from Faulkner: "The past isn't dead, it's not even past," right? And the other is that the etymology of the word question, of course, is centered on the word quest, right? So how do we pose the correct questions that allow us to solve the actual problem? And the solution to the problem must be generative. It has to take us somewhere else. That's the fundamental essence of American life, is that we're always moving, always being propelled forward. To also fold in a few thoughts from the last question about what I think are some of the most interesting innovations. the work that I do is very centered on older adults, and I think a lot about how do we democratize senior living. And for me, the answer is how do we create interdisciplinary communities of care that instrument the social determinants of health? And so, what does this mean? What is the gift of COVID throughout all of this? The number one gift of COVID, if there is one, is that we understood, I think, for the first time collectively as a globe, how much we actually care about each other, right? We really, really miss each other when we don't get to spend time with each other, when we don't get to have dinner, when we can't go to birthdays, and we can't celebrate Thanksgiving together. This makes us ache. The other thing I wanted to center is, the devastation for older adults in nursing homes, how difficult that was, right? And we're really seeing we care about older people. They are very, very important to us. So when I think about what are the most interesting innovations, they're really about how do we think about design for regeneration, right? And it's going to require us, again, folding in Leonardo, to reimagine the ideal city. Wow, that is so exciting.
Wow, yeah, it is. And there's a whole nother, I'm trying to think about that. We can have a whole nother discussion on exactly how that ideal city looks and functions and how it works. And we should do that. I want to ask you guys kind of a personal question, which actually, Sean, you inspired me about this. You told me about something that I had not heard of before, but I bet everybody on this call has. And that's the notion of forest baths in Japanese culture, where people find time to get away from their desk, from their workshop, from their factory, from their busy city, and go into nature. And when we think of Leonardo and his incredible acuity to the natural world and how he took the lessons of the natural world and used them to better understand the human world. I'm wondering how you think about your own personal relationship to nature. We're in this beautiful spot on the globe. And what role does that play in sustaining a culture of innovation? Does it play a role? In Japan, and Sean, I'm putting words into your mouth, but it is an important regeneration of creativity. And we are blessed with an environment like that. And as we think of global climate change and the challenges to nature globally, what is the role of the human interface with the natural environment as we think about creating a sustainable, innovative culture? Any thoughts on that? That's a big question, so feel free to answer it in any way you choose.
I guess since you pushed me out there on forest bathing habits. So yeah, I got thinking about this because I was going from Zoom to Zoom to Zoom to Teams to Zoom to Slack to 20 times a day. And getting to the end of the day and saying, I didn't do anything meaningful today. I didn't get anything done and burnt out. And so you go through weeks and weeks of that and you're feeling burnt out and you're not able to use your superpowers the way that you used to do what you needed to do every day. And so I started taking walks and listening to podcasts, which is somebody proposed, forest bathing as a way to reset your brain. And I was starting to do some thinking about, deep work. And there's a discussion in the technology sector about how do you do deep work, actual deep work and deep thinking that's required to be innovative. And how do you do that when you're frequency skipping between Zoom meetings and distracted by email and your Slack chime going off and there's a big discussion about how you just kind of answer your email in the morning and you shut everything else off and you do your work and maybe you check it at noon and then you shut off again until the end of the day. And applying that to thinking and being creative and applying those soft skills that are really necessary for like innovation, this deep thinking that's required to solve problems and be open and present to other people's ideas. And so that's kind of how I got to forest bathing and just sort of trying to reset your brain so you can actually do that deep thinking and deep work.
Anyone else want to take a stab at that? Thank you, Sean, for sharing.
Well,
That's
and we
powerful.
live here in the Pacific Northwest.
I know.
Like,
Yeah, it's too easy.
how, you know, it's maybe that's a little secret sauce we have up here. Is that
well, I
we
think
kinda
that's
get the,
It is, yeah.
yeah. Everybody's off on mute, so you all have something to say. So, Mike, why don't we start with you, and we'll go to Anna and Lorraine.
No, I absolutely, I think that is part of the secret sauce going back. It's just the, you can't dispute that living in such a beautiful area where you're always in the shadow of Tahoma, and then you have Puget Sound right there, that you can't get away, and we're natural creatures, and that's our natural state, and when we take ourselves away from that, it's unhealthy. So it is important to get out there and recharge, and yeah.
I'll follow up with that. And Sean, when you said the words deep thinking, my brain just, it's like my heart went into my brain. It is so important to have time to reflect, to center, to read deeply, like actual books from end to end, and oh, by the way, discuss them with human beings and reflect. And it is a very difficult thing to do. We definitely have created technologies that are centered around information, but not really thought about technology when it comes to supporting deep generative thinking and community connection. And what I wanted to fold in here, and I think the book that I just picked up is apt, right, is that there is such a barrier between the ability to deeply think and get away and step away when we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I also want to say, as a mother, it is even harder as a mother, right? So, and we've seen this during COVID, the impact that the toll of multitasking and context shifting has had on women and mothers in particular. So one of the questions I have for all of us is, how do we think through creating the avenue towards deep work so that it's accessible for everybody? So that's the observation and the question, the challenge.
Yeah, Lorraine.
Well, I was going to say a word for recreation, that taking a walk, which I think all of us have mentioned. To me, I'm in my 70s, I'm a caregiver for a very ill husband. Life has been pretty difficult, but I know how to recreate. I take a long, long walk alone. And I know that that's not listening, and it's not all the other things we've been talking about. Can't do everything all at one time. But the rhythm of my feet is the rhythm of my blood. And in silence, and even in the cacophony of an urban setting, taking a long walk, and I mean like 3 hours, that for me is a long walk. It's recreation in an alone space. I come back with new, not structures so much, but new perspectives that I couldn't gain any other way. And I've made some of you go on walks with me because I do think it's a good way to converse. I have loved leading walking tours where you get a group of people and you all work at the same pace, and then you come together, and it's like sitting around a campfire, having been to that quiet rhythmic place all together. I would love to see many, many more people in Seattle simply walking and then getting together. It's a simple thing, but for me, it's been very, very helpful.
That's so interesting to think about how we incorporate these habits into our lives so that we can stay innovative. And one question we have, and I do want to get this out because this was put in early, and Anna, I agree. We should get on those innovation forest walks. We've got the place to do it, don't we? I'm curious, the questioner asks, about what do people think about the role of I'm going to interpret this a little bit. Personal energy. We've talked about, decoupling ourselves from stress, as we've talked about forest bathing. But what about energy? How do we energize ourselves so that we can be leading listeners? I'll use that metaphor, that we all are leaders if we're all listeners, so that we all play that role. But the question is, what is the role of individual initiation and energy as we think about a culture of innovation? Mike, why don't we start with you on that one? We'll just go around quickly and see if others have anything that they want to add to that.
Well, in my other life, I was a football coach. So the whole idea of being a leader and a coach, you've got to set the tone. So I had to teach myself, how to get my own self prepared, get into that place where I can inspire others. And it's, I don't know, I don't know if I can describe it in a short time, but I think that, that's what works for me, is that I just learned, I learned how to do that being a football coach, and it just pays off in being a leader and in trying to inspire the people around me. I just continue to be Coach Lombardi.
That sounds very familiar, Mike.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you know it. And,
yeah.
And relation is distant. Right? We're from the same part of Italy, but distant cousins.
There you go. Okay, but great, both great coaches. Anyone else want to take a stab at answering our listeners' question?
I love curiosity and a sense of humor in the person framing the space within which I'm intended to innovate. There are no wrong answers. There's sort of a phased experience, but laughter and curiosity. If a leader can frame that, throw out those sparks for me, that lights fires in me. And that is what I love in a leader of innovation: curiosity and humor.
Very good. Very good. Sean or Anna?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I saw it pop up, and I think when you have a bunch of people around the table, one of the skills somebody brings is that energy, to bring up the energy or ideas to start off with, and it's infectious. People bring their energy up. You play up to the energy level, and I think it's important that there's sort of an energy starter that's in the room when you get a group of people trying to solve a problem that's infectious, and it's not necessarily someone comes to the room with a vision that everyone rallies around. It's that they coalesce together and create a vision together. And if there's a mission that everyone's interested in doing, then that vision sort of evolves from those individuals that are there. And many times there's multiple people in the room that have the energy, the catalyst that elevates the group of people to really do something special.
Yeah, very, very well said. Anna.
I loved that. I loved all your answers. I would add to this that to inspire means to give breath. And when we inspire others, we give them breath, we give them the opportunity to access their own innate energy. And everybody has a different, to follow Lorraine's footsteps, literally a different cadence. Some people burn really brightly and they've got incredible charisma, right? But overplayed, that can silence other people in the room, right? On the other side, there are people who are extremely quiet, right? And need to be coaxed or need to contribute and inspire in different ways and in different directions. So I think that it's important to figure out how to create a room of inspiration, right? Where we can inspire each other using lots of different modalities. And the other part of this too is an awareness that we're whole people. We're actually human beings. We're not just like characters on TV who play innovation roles, right? Like we go home, we have complex family lives, we have challenges, we have things that worry us, places where we're insecure, where we don't feel settled. So I think that, just creating a sense of humanness in our work is core to creating a culture of charisma, a culture of inspiration in the room more broadly.
You know, that's beautiful, Anna. There really is. And all of these thoughts they are inspiring. I love that the etymology of that is to breathe. It sounds so right, and I had forgotten that. When I visit the Da Vinci Inventions exhibit, it's poignant in so many ways because none of these ideas were really physically manifested or realized in Leonardo's own time. He saved these ideas, he thought of them, he observed them, and he wrote them down. And over centuries, they began to be realized. And they are still being realized. And I think maybe as we conclude our conversation, I come back to the ideal city, that there are ideas embedded in the Da Vinci Inventions exhibit, which we have yet to fully realize, but we all know that what we contribute, just as when Leonardo contributed a thought in a notebook written backwards, that is a seed that will blossom if it is fertilized and given care and allowed to grow. That's what inspires me particularly about the exhibit. And as I think of the seeds that we are laying that will not be fulfilled in our own time, I look toward the future when some of these things will be manifested. If we were to pick one thing that we are passionate about to see move forward into the future and be realized as a fundamental innovation, I'd be curious as to what that might be. There's so many things we can pick from in this world that's challenged in so many ways and also has so many opportunities. So let's see, I introduced people in reverse order or something like that. Well, I'm just going to start with my screen and give you guys a few seconds to think about it. This is so unfair to you guys. Let's see, who should I start with as we conclude? Anybody got a thought? Lorraine, would it be terrible to ask you to go first?
The ideal city, I spent some time looking at the model and thinking about the future. We need a place where we can disagree with respect and where the goal of disagreement is discussion and decision and moving forward. So that at a party I had a few days ago, a bunch of people sat around and we talked about where we would like metropolitan Seattle to be in 2050 and what each of our roles might be in getting there. And thank God we were drinking wine because this is really tough. It's not hard to say what you'd like to see happen. It's harder to say what your role might be in facilitating that. And I won't bore you with, all of our conversation, but that kind of a question and that kind of a studio of discussion, that is what I would like to see in Seattle. And I read all the comments in the Seattle Times after the political articles, and you see anonymous people who are so angry and unhappy, who are not having that kind of a conversation of mutual respect because they can't see each other. Again, I just come back again to a museum and its role in a community, a university, a library. It doesn't really matter that much as long as we can sit around a hearth of respect and talk our way through our problems to the ideal city of 2050 in which each one of us has a role.
Wow. The hearth of respect, that is something to really hold on to, I think. Sean, let me turn to you and ask you any thoughts you might have as we ponder the future.
Oh, wow. How do I follow that up? Yeah, I just think finding that balance between technology and our natural world around us and those human interactions that Anna was describing that we all miss now that we huddle in our own homes without going out as often anymore. It's getting better. I think just finding that balance that where we don't have these chasms of disagreement and grievances that are unbridgeable. I think just that's the only thing that really comes to mind is that balance, yin and yang, in trying to move closer to that type of a society, rather than such a divided community that we find ourselves in these days.
Yeah. One of the lessons we've learned from the Bezos Center is that collaboration is the key ingredient that has happened in every innovation at any scale. So thank you for reminding us of that. Mike, from your perspective, any thoughts?
Yeah, what I want to finish with is I think something inspirational and really thinking about the triumph of the human spirit. And when I look at Leonardo's invention for the air, essentially an airplane, right? That was, you think about the Renaissance and how the Renaissance was inspired by the classical world. And before Leonardo and his bird invention, we go back to Icarus and Daedalus, and we see that dream, that great dream of humanity to fly, goes back to the very beginning, and it carried through to Leonardo. And then we get to the 19th century and this whole idea of bringing back the Renaissance persona. And at that time, that dream is achieved. And then when we move forward to today, the people in our community here in Seattle, people that go to work every day to those big buildings up in Everett and in Renton, and with their heart and their passion and their skills, they put together these beautiful airplanes that fly around the world. And when you think about it, what has that done? We have shrunk the world. We have brought humanity together, and we have finally given that ancient dream of flight. We have made that a reality. So there is greatness in the human spirit. There is greatness in those ancient ideas and how over time we can accomplish them. And this is still the beginning. The next great adventure, we are just starting. We are just starting as a spacefaring race, and we have an incredible future that's out there in the stars.
Mm-hmm. And that's beautifully stated. I know one of the things that Jeff Bezos talks about at Blue Origin is that going into space and that incredible adventure is also about making our home as humans on planet Earth, as you said, Mike, earlier, Earthlings, making that healthy and sustainable, which is another existential challenge. Anna, I'll let you share your thoughts as a conclusion tonight.
Oh, golly, thank you. And thank you so much, Leonard, for having us, and Michael and Sean and Lorraine. What a privilege it is to be in conversation with the three of you. I'm just, you think about the towering strength of our community. It's people like you and the many wonderful people you bring together through your work and you inspire. And really, it's been so wonderful to have time with you and begin to get to know you a little bit. I would say my thoughts about the ideal city and what we can do together. First, to just build off of what Michael said, dreams matter. And we need to give dreams time and space, right? They are really what propel us forward. The most impossible dream, right? This idea of flight, for example, it took millennia, tens of thousands of years for people to achieve it, but they wanted it so much. We wanted it so much, we made it possible. Today we really have to think about how do we bring our planet forward. We're facing an existential threat that we're really not prepared for. And so we have to center, what do we love? What matters to us? How can we bring this whole world forward? And I want to center what Lorraine talked about a community of hearth. So the etymology of the word hearth comes from heart, right? And so my ideal city is one that truly centers care and caring. And that the idea would be that we center care and caring and community, and we build backwards from those ideas, right? Using this panoply of innovations that are at our disposal today. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we have solutions today to the problems that we face. And it is the essence of innovation for us to recombine those existing solutions towards the deepest and best purpose. And then finally, when it comes to the ideal city, two concluding thoughts. It should not be ideal. It should be a mess. And it should be a beautiful, stunning, hot mess that reconnects us to the natural world. And then finally, it's really important that we make space when we think about the conception of the urban environment for women, for children, and for older people. The built environment has been defined almost exclusively by men for millennia. And so this is an important opportunity for us to center other people, other ways of being, right? Other life stages as we bring the future forward.
Anna, thank you. And I think one of the things you've just said, that dreams matter, is a really good note to end on, because I think that is something that we all have the ability to do. We can all dream, and dreams are the first step towards the realizations we've talked about. I don't know how to thank you guys, because it was absolutely an amazing conversation, and I would love to continue this at another time, and we will do that. We've even got the idea of taking innovation for forest walks. We will do that and invite everybody along in the community to join us. And I just want to, on behalf of MOHAI, thank all of you again. By the way, this Saturday, November 13th, is Kindness Day. So one of the things we can take from this is to wave our kindness flags and wear it in our heart this weekend. But I am so deeply appreciative of all of you. Kelsey, thank you so much for bringing us together and having this great conversation. Thanks all the people who joined us online tonight with their great questions and their interest. And Rachel, is there anything we need to do to wrap up?
I just want to say thank you to you, Leonard, for all of your wonderful moderation and skillfully weaving the conversation along, as well as a big thank you to all of our speakers. We're so lucky to have you sharing with us. Also, if you enjoyed, wanted to invite you to come back next Wednesday for History Cafe. We're going to be talking about the challenges and successes of documenting the pandemic and what it's like being a historical organization living through a hugely historic event. So we're going to have a great panel. Please join us. And finally, if you learn something new or appreciate the work we do, we always would love you to consider making a gift to help support the museum and support future programming like this. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful evening and stay happy and healthy.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, and good night.
Good night.